Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation on Wellness Unwrapped. I'm so excited to have you tuning in from Florida.
Florida, yeah.
Yeah, so it's so wonderful that we can kind of connect on Zoom. I'm in the north of England. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with you, having followed you avidly on Instagram. And we're going to dig into the topic of how the modern world is affecting our brain, affecting the entirety of our health, and what we can do about it.
Great. Well, certainly a lot to discuss there, but I'd like to start with some bigger picture questions.
Sure.
The main one would be, why should we care about this at all? There are so many different ideas out there competing for our time. And what I would start with is a question of, are we doing the best that we could? Are we doing as humans as well as we can, considering everything that's going on? Humans are very resilient. They tend to do great in a variety of situations. But what we find is now the case in the modern world is that we have these preventable problems. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at rates of chronic, largely preventable diseases, you see that most people, especially in the United States and in England as well, but worldwide, are developing these chronic degenerative conditions to the point where in the United States, most people will have at least one chronic disease. So these are things like heart disease and diabetes. And then if you look at mental health, which I think is actually one of the biggest epidemics that we're facing today, you see that around 30% of people in their lifetime will experience what is technically an anxiety disorder, and around 20% or so will experience depression to a significant degree. And so, to some extent, these things just happen, but in large part, these are preventable conditions. We're learning so much about everything from metabolic diseases to things like depression and where they have overlaps as far as the pathophysiology. So then we've got to ask, is it possible for us to prevent these conditions? So maybe they are preventable, but can we actually do that? Can we make that happen? And as I'm sure you know very well, and as I'm sure listeners already understand, we have the tools necessary as far as dietary modification, exercise, things like mindfulness. We know these things work, and it's just a question of, can we apply them? It's not as though anyone is out there arguing that we need to drink more soda or that we need to exercise less. So then it becomes a question of, are we capable of making these things happen? Are we capable of making the healthy decision over the unhealthy decision? And so that gets us to the question of, how do we actually make decisions? And, there's this interesting kind of dynamic that exists right now where people believe that decisions are made on the spot, where if you come up to a lunchroom cafeteria and there's a healthy option and an unhealthy option, that everything that's happened before that moment doesn't matter, that you get to make the choice. It's a voluntary choice. And it's basically up to you and your willpower to decide if you're going to go with the healthy or the unhealthy option. And yet this isn't really the case at all. What we know is that by looking at the extremes of behavior, for example, in addiction, that there are measurable changes in the brain that are linked to people making unhealthy choices around using drugs. So if we can believe that maybe it is a brain-based model of decision-making, that the brain wiring, that the brain connections have a lot to do with the way that we make choices, then we can start looking at how we can change those brain pathways to lead to healthier choices and thereby get to the outcomes that we care about. What are those outcomes? Again, it's talking about things like lower risk of chronic diseases, and that includes metabolic diseases as well as mental health conditions. So I'm sure we'll go into this in a lot of detail in this podcast, but the bottom line is that we have the ability to modulate these outcomes we care about. We have the ability to lower our chances for these degenerative conditions like heart disease, like Alzheimer's disease, like diabetes, some types of cancers, as well as these mental health conditions like depression, like anxiety, through our choices. And we can affect our brains such that we make those choices more likely, as opposed to the way the modern world is unfortunately setting up our brains, which is to make those choices, make it more likely that we make the poor choices.
Yeah. And that's really positive news, isn't it? That's straight off. That's a fantastic, empowering message for people, because certainly where I live in the northwest of England, we have very poor health outcomes. We have a lot of obesity. Huge. Our National Health Service is is being crippled under the weight of chronic disease, very much including type 2 diabetes. And I often find that people feel that they are just doomed to develop a chronic disease and almost half expect to. I remember my mum going to see one of her many specialists recently, and he said to her, look, you either get heart disease, or you get cancer, or you get, but it was kind of like expected that you get one of a menu of chronic diseases, and that's just the way it is. But I think what you and I would say is that actually that's not the way that it has to be, and certainly not the way that we are designed to be. But it starts with that realization that we do have a choice, don't we?
Right. Well, so many things that you said that are incredibly important for listeners to appreciate. And yes, I completely agree. This is an empowering message, because when you look at how things are, I mean, as you described, how things have to be, or how things are said they're going to become, for example, that you will develop heart disease or diabetes or cancer, just because this is what's happening on average doesn't mean it's inevitable. And it's just the case where, because things are so bad, we've accepted that they need to remain that way, when we know that, as I said before, so many of these conditions are actually preventable. And so it kind of harkens back to this parallel concept of genetic determinism, right? Where you basically say you have everything that's going to happen in your life programmed into your genes. There's nothing you can do about it. If your genes say you're going to get heart disease, if they say you're going to get diabetes, that's what's going to happen. And what we've realized is, yes, our genes do play a role in what happens in our lives, but probably not nearly as much as what we thought. And the reason for that is because our choices actually change the way our genes are expressed. This is the idea of epigenetics. And so that means we can modulate the way that our genes are translated into our health outcomes. So yes, our genes are there. They play a large role in this, but we get to decide how they're read. So sometimes people say, as it relates to a disease, the genes are loading the gun, but you have to be the one that pulls that trigger. And I think it's a helpful analogy, because it means that we actually do have the power to change our health outcomes. And so to bring it back to this model I'm describing of the brain, the way that we look at decision making, as I said before, it's a function of willpower. So it's, if you have the right information and you make the wrong decision, then that means that you don't have the willpower, and therefore you're at fault. You should be blamed. And in essence, there's nothing more that a provider or anyone else can do. But if you ask how the brain affects the decisions you make, and if you understand that it's the decades sometimes of wiring of your brain, that starts from an early age. So that's talking about basically programming of the HPA axis in early life. It's talking about programming of the brain's immune system by way of the microbiome in early life, and the fact that we can continue to affect that as we go on. Then you can start saying, well, maybe this isn't so helpful to look at this from this blame perspective. And instead, let's look at how we can change our brains such that it makes the better decisions more likely to happen. And so I just think that opens the door to a wide variety of lifestyle interventions that then both take away blame and get us excited again about the ability to make these outcomes more likely. And it's not, I have to emphasize this again, because I think that usually in these types of conversations, we talk about these metabolic diseases, because metabolic diseases like diabetes and heart disease, these are the things we talk about: blood sugar, we talk about blood pressure, that we know our diet can have a big effect on. But we're now learning that, again, through some of these brain-based mechanisms, what we eat, how we sleep, things like mindfulness and meditation can actually change the way that our brains are wired, using some of those metabolic pathways that we usually associated only with blood pressure and heart disease in order for us to have better lives. So it's all connected. And I think that, if you're able to wire your brain for better mood, that is going to do so much more, and it's going to provide you a long-term compounding effect as it relates to every other aspect of your health. So I really think we need to incorporate those mental health aspects of preventive health in these types of conversations.
I couldn't agree more with you, Austin. I really couldn't. And I love what you said about not blaming people, because I think people can feel that they're being made to feel somehow culpable for their own poor health. And that's, and again, I love the fact that your message is so empowering and so compassionate, really. But what you mentioned about being dictated, our health and our future being dictated by, not being dictated primarily by genes, really struck a chord with me, because as you were talking, I was recalling a visit I made with my mum to the cemetery. Just a few months ago, we went to visit my father's grave in the cemetery, and we always passed by my mum's parents, and I never really asked her what exactly had happened to her mum. I knew she'd passed away at the age of 52, which is just like 2.5 years older than me. And what I hadn't fully appreciated was that, and I kind of knew that she had type 2 diabetes, but it turns out that she pointed at every single grave of her family. Every single person had type 2 diabetes. So mum was the only person in the entire family, going back to grandparents and aunts and cousins, who didn't have this condition. And it really, I think it brought into focus for me how at risk I was as well, because I wasn't always a health coach. I used to work in PR. I used to eat terribly. I used to just eat refined carbs all day long. And it was only very recently, in the past few years, that I changed my lifestyle. And I think I was probably well on the road. I have to say, probably well on the road, even though I'm not overweight. So I never thought that I was at risk of developing something like type 2 diabetes. But now I know I absolutely was. So I think this is a message for everybody, isn't it? Whether you're overweight or not, whether you're currently suffering from a chronic condition or not, it's about recognizing that our environment is putting us on that conveyor belt, whether we're aware of it or not. But what you're going to talk about is how we can remove ourselves from that conveyor belt, which we may not consciously know that we're on.
Yeah, and to your point, I think that people need to first understand that the world we live in, the modern world, is not set up for us to be successful. And I mean that, again, from a physical and a mental health perspective. It's set up to optimize for other variables, whether that's GDP or just, capitalist wealth, and not to get into the specifics of that. But I'm not saying those are good or bad. I'm just saying that we need to understand that it's not optimizing for our health. And once you appreciate that, and once you understand that the status quo is not healthy, then you don't feel so bad about saying, I'm going to make some changes. Because if you don't make a change, if you don't make a break from what everyone else is doing, you will, on average, wind up with an average outcome. So what are those average outcomes? It's poor physical and mental health. It doesn't mean it's inevitable. It just means if you continue the path of least resistance, this is probably what's going to happen. And so once you are willing to say, that's not good enough for me, I don't accept that, I'm not going to accept the status quo, there are so many options out there as far as ways to make breaks from it. But what I would like to focus on most is the reprogramming of the brain that enables you to continue to see paths forward. Because the first step to be able to really make a break from what everyone else is doing is to understand that it's possible. It's to understand that you have options. And then it's to understand how to apply those and how to begin to implement them over the course of days to weeks to months to years, such that you then divert from the standard trajectory and go off and find your healthy path forward. So let me give, I guess, a couple of examples to show people what this means. If you consider how thoughts happen, if you consider how decisions are made, you have both conscious and unconscious processes working in the brain. And one of the most powerful unconscious processes that decides what we do is our habit loop, right? It's the habit formation. And so what are habits? Habits are, in essence, these automatic behaviors that we do without thinking about them. And so examples we'd use or include when you're driving in the car and you just realize that you've been driving for a while, but you didn't actually think about what you were doing. Your body has more or less taken over. It's kept its eyes on the road. It's kept your hands on the wheel. or brushing your teeth. You might find yourself brushing your teeth and not really remembering, how did I get here and why did I start doing this? Because your mind was, you were thinking about other things. So in essence, the body automates things that are repetitive so that it allows your conscious mind to worry about other things that are going on. And to be fair, sometimes your conscious mind worries about things that don't matter at all. It's just sitting there thinking about, next Thursday, I have to bring casserole to somebody's party. Let me consider this for the next 3 hours while the rest of your body takes over and brushes your teeth. Here's the thing about habits. There's really no obligation for them to be programmed to your benefit. And so if you do what everyone else is doing in the modern world, you are going to develop unhealthy habits because that's what's easiest. That's what's repeated. And so that might mean driving into the fast food restaurant every day after work, because when you see that fast food sign, your body just knows, here's the loop, here's the habit loop. I drive in, I get this food, I eat this food. Similarly, you may have a habit loop around collapsing on the couch after you get home from work and eating a bag of chips and watching 3 hours of TV. So basically, these are programmed into your brain, and it's not something that you're consciously aware of how it's happening. It just kind of takes up this room in your unconscious loop in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia that keeps you doing the same thing time and time again. But what's really cool is that now that we understand how habits are formed, we are able to repopulate those habits with things that are helpful to us. We are able to think through, how do I make a new and healthy habit? Well, it has to be done in the same place every day. It has to be done in a repeated way. So you have to make sure you're doing this time and time again. And ideally, you have to program it in with a little bit of reward. Over time, habits actually don't link to reward, which is another kind of interesting point. But once you're able to do that, then you can say, I'm going to divert and start exercising more. I'm going to start eating healthy food, not because you have to exert all of this conscious control and force yourself into it and then blame yourself when you don't do it, but because now you're able to understand how your brain wiring works and use it to your advantage. So that's the habit-based idea that says you can take over your brain wiring for better outcomes for yourself and not let those be programmed by, I'm not saying malicious, I don't want to say conspiracy, it's nothing like that. It's just the people who make money off of you making bad choices would like to continue making money off of you making bad choices, whether that's you eating unhealthy foods or binge watching TV for 4 hours at a time. And so they're going to do everything they can to program that into habits.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a huge point. And I have to tell you that, when you mentioned about eating chips in the evening, so we actually call them crisps in the UK. And, you have a lot of fabulous things over in the States, Austin, but we in Britain, we have the best crisps in the world. And I was a total crisp addict. So my favorite flavor, salt and vinegar crisp, which is a very classic British crisp. And my daily habit was to have a family size pack every night of the week, literally every night of the week. And this was until very recently. It was the last thing, when I became a health coach, I kind of changed a lot of things, but I wasn't giving up my crisps. I just loved them too much. And I would make really spurious arguments to myself. I say, do you know what? I don't smoke. Like really rubbish ways to try and reassure myself that it was fine. And even when I was a health coach, I was still eating the crisps. And then I actually went to the IFM, so that's the Institute for Functional Medicine annual conference. This would have been three years ago, I think, in LA. And so your dad, who's Dr. David Perlmutter, who's an incredible, incredible guy, he gave these extraordinary 2 presentations about neuroplasticity and about all the things, all the assaults on our brain. And I got the chance to chat to him one-to-one, and also to Mark Hyman, who also, is an incredible doctor and person. And I don't know if it was by osmosis, just being in the company of these people for 3 days solid, but I came back, I opened the cupboard, and I saw my family pack size crisps, and I couldn't eat them. I just decided that I couldn't do it anymore, and that I knew too much. I just knew too much about the brain and about how I wanted to keep my brain for the sake of my kids and me. You know, I've got 3 kids. I want to stay healthy, and I want to conserve my brain so that they don't have to look after me because, God forbid, I've got dementia. And I stopped. But previous to that, I had tried. I had said to my family, I'm not having the crisps anymore. You know, don't let me have the crisps. And I said to my daughter, who was about 11 at the time, I said, you're not to let me have the crisps. And then one day I had just a really stressful day. And I was like, I need my crisps. And my husband went out to get them for me. And my daughter said, but Mummy, you said not to have. I said, I know I said that, but I need them. So I kind of get it. I'm not sitting here saying it's easy to change habits. I've been stuck in habits too. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's break this down a little bit, because I think this is a great example of talking through what it both keeps us stuck in habits and what enables us to write new ones. You mentioned the kind of routine that you had around eating these crisps every day, and that is exactly what programs in a habit. It basically tells your body, this is what happens every day at this hour. When I get home from work, I'm feeling a little bit stressed, and I do this thing where I eat these crisps, and then I feel a little bit better. But you're not consciously thinking that. You're not getting home from work and saying, I don't feel very good. It'd be great if there was a solution. Let me think through all the possible options. Oh, these are in the cabinet. Let me make these. Now I feel better. Let's close the loop. Instead, what's happening is your brain says, this is just what we do. This is just like in the morning, we wake up and we brush our teeth. It's when we get home, we eat these. But then you mentioned the stress piece of it, which I think is so interesting. And the reason for that is there's a good amount of research that shows that as we become more stressed, our actions become more habitual. So that means that when our brain is kind of overloaded, when we don't have the reserve to think things through and weigh the pros and cons, we revert back to our habitual actions, which in this case might have been for you eating this junk food. Okay, so now let's talk about maybe what happened on the other end of this, how you were able to stop this unhealthy habit. There's a researcher out at Stanford called BJ Fogg. He wrote a book recently called Tiny Habits. His work is excellent, but he, in essence, is one of the premier researchers on habit formation. And he's developed this model where he basically says that habits or behaviors are a function of a couple of variables. So in order for a behavior to occur, you need to have adequate motivation, you need to have the right ability, and then you need to be prompted or triggered, right? So if you think through what had happened to you when you were at this conference, so your motivation probably went way up because all of a sudden you were around these speakers, you were inspired, you said, I'm just done with this. Now, the ability to do it probably didn't change that much to stop this old habit that wasn't healthy. It was always right there to do it. It's very easy to do it. You could stop doing it if you just threw away the crisps. So maybe it wasn't the ability as much, but it was the motivation that spiked and enabled you to make that change. And then the prompt or the trigger was probably, again, you were with these people. You said, now is the moment to do this. And that was enough to get you to take the action. So what it means, though, is, for people listening, let's say you happen to eat a bunch of crisps, or in the States, whatever the chips equivalent would be fries. You've got to think through this not as a personality issue or a character flaw, but as a neural pathway that can be reprogrammed through neuroplasticity. And we know on average, it takes about 66 days for a new habit to really sink into your brain and become automated, which is the goal. Because until then, you're going to have to be thinking through, okay, I need to do this new behavior. I need to do this new behavior. Your goal is to get to the point where you no longer have to do this new behavior consciously. It just happens, whether that's exercising or eating healthy or meditating each day, where it's just, this is now what I do in this situation. So I highly recommend, again, BJ Fogg and his work.
Yeah, I've read his work. He's amazing. Yeah.
I think it's really helpful as it relates to rewiring your brain habits. But the stuff that we talk about in Brainwash, the book I wrote with my dad, it overlaps with that, but it also has to do with giving your brain the ability to see this in the first place. And so to that end, I'd love to talk about kind of a couple of modern world influences that seem to inhibit the brain's ability to see the logic, to weigh the pros and cons, and to give us our executive functions that we need to be able to have the idea of even changing that habit, to be able to say, this is something that I don't want to do anymore. I'd like to do something else, to give you that space between what is typical, which is just reacting, and reflecting, which is our goal. That gives you the opening to start making positive changes in your life.
Yeah. It's that, I mean, what you said is so true, because I'm actually, for me, it wasn't when I got home from work. It was like when I was watching TV after dinner. And I grew up in a family where I'm one of 6 kids, and we always just went to the crisp cupboard after dinner. So we just had this ingrained habit that you eat crisps in the evening, and we're huge. We all love crisps. And funny enough, when I stopped eating them and I kind of publicly announced, I'm through with the crisps, I'm not eating them anymore, my sister said, if Susie stopped eating crisps, I need to stop, because she knew that I was the biggest crisp eater that anyone had ever met. So she thought they must be bad if Susie stopped. So she also stopped. But then I actually went to one of my friends. A guy had his 50th recently, and we stayed in his house for, he had a dinner party, and he said, Suze, look, I've got your crisps. I've got your favorite salt and vinegar crisps. I've got them for you. And he brought them over from England. We were actually in France, and I just didn't have the heart to tell him that I'd stopped eating crisps. So I ate the whole bowl.
This has happened to all of us. I've been eating healthy, but then I went to this dinner party and they prepared this giant bowl of ravioli. So I wasn't eating gluten. I wasn't eating gluten. I wasn't eating carbs. I wasn't eating dairy. But what could I say? And I think that is such an important point. I mean, there are kind of these two aspects of it. One is there are these social norms, and it's really hard for humans to break social norms. We don't want to disappoint others. Our relationships are incredibly important. So that's part of it. But the other piece is, so again, looking at research on addiction, we know that over time, certain pathways in the brain kind of change their set point. And so you see dopamine receptors and dopamine levels can change kind of for the rest of people's lives in certain types of drug use. So methamphetamine, for example. And so what that means is that even if you've completely stopped using a chemical, heroin, cocaine, whatever, for years at a time, that when you use it again, it's not like you're going back to, square one, like anyone who hasn't tried it. Those pathways still exist, and you may be hypersensitive to it. So what it means is, in your case, it's a bigger deal for you to eat that bag of crisps than it is for somebody else who has never had a problem with it. And seems like you're doing okay now, but it does mean I think we need to be extra cautious. And sometimes it's just that little slip up where it's going down those same pathways, activating those same pathways in the brain that can then lead to significant consequences in setting us back. So one of the things that I've kind of promoted over the last several months is the ability to, not that I agree necessarily with the policy as it relates to drugs, but to just say no for these instances as it relates to food, that it's okay to say, I just don't do well with this. And you don't have to give people the explanation. They don't need to know that it's not a question of immediate physiological GI symptoms, that instead it's, I don't do well because I get kind of stuck eating these things time and time again. And so when you go to a friend's house and they bring out dessert and they made that special cake or pie, say, listen, this is so nice of you, but my body just does very poorly with this. And so I'm not going to be able to participate. And then it's understanding that when that person perhaps gives you that peer pressure or grief, that it's okay. That's what you want to have happen, because that shows that you are standing up for what you care about and looking after yourself. And I think we just really need to be able to better tolerate that as necessary, because it comes back to the point I made before, which is most people are not doing well. And so if you aren't willing to deviate from, to push back against the status quo, you're going to just go closer to what other people are experiencing, which is poor health.
Yes. I I think it's hard though. It's very hard for people if you're a people pleaser and or you just don't want to be the odd one out. You know, if all your friends binge drink beer and they're all sitting, you know, hoovering up chocolate bars and crisps, it's really hard for people who think, well, if I say no, will they still like me? You know, will they still want to be my friend? So there's so much that comes into it. Or if it's like a religious or cultural thing, because I've coached people from many religions where at certain times of the year they will eat in a way that they know makes them put on weight and they don't feel good. But they'll just say, I'm with my aunties and this is what everyone does, and I don't want to offend anyone. So I think it's easy if you hang out with people who, you know, work in the health sphere and are very healthy. But if not, you've got that added layer of complication, haven't you?
Absolutely. There's so much to think about there. And I just think about the influence of peer pressure as a whole, and going back to the times when that is most significant. And so for most people, I think that would be adolescence, probably into college, where binge drinking is the norm. And if you're not doing it, you're either not cool or you're not accepted or you're not fun. And so these are societal pressures that we do need to, I think in some cases, dismantle or at least expose as unhealthy. What interests me is looking at how the brain circuitry and neurochemistry changes across the lifespan and how that might then make people more susceptible to these types of pressures. So what you see is in adolescence and going into the early 20s, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that gives you the ability to reflect and say, hang on, you know, I know everybody else is taking tequila shots, but that's actually not in line with who I want to be and the person I want to become. That part of the brain isn't fully developed until your mid-20s. And what we know is that the dopaminergic system is different in younger people as well as the very old. And that probably changes the way that they make decisions. They may make them more susceptible to, in younger people, making rash decisions, right? Making impulsive choices. And then in older people, that could be part of the reason why they're more susceptible to scams, which is something that in Florida is a huge issue because these telemarketing type people target the elderly and in essence get them to spend thousands of dollars on things that don't exist. So if you look at, again, the brain programming, you see that certain age groups, certain demographics are more susceptible to making poor decisions. And part of that might speak to this peer pressure thing. But I also think that there has to be, or there is, this neuroplastic effect, which is that if you are able to say no to peer pressure across a range of different situations, then that then becomes part of your personality. And obviously, you don't want to be the difficult person. With that said, I am definitely the difficult person in my friend circle as far as food choices. It's not fun sometimes for other people to be with somebody that is very rigid with foods. And I'm not a fan of being rigid in general. I don't think it's a good life approach. But I do think it's worth remembering, again, that most foods are unhealthy these days. So most of the foods that people consume in the United States, for example, 68% of foods that they looked at, over 1 million foods they looked at, contained added sugars. And that was drinks and solid foods. Added sugars are good for no one. They do nothing for your health except for they taste good and they make people want to continue to consume those products. So in some ways, what you see is that because of the manipulation of the food system, it's actually changed the neural programming of people such that they don't really see how bad these things are for them, or they can't stop using them because it's become part of their habitual loops. So I guess with all that said, I think the more that a person can understand about what is actually going on, the more that enables them to switch into this reflective part of their brain and say, what's happening right now? You know, I know I'm being peer pressured into this thing. I want to be conscious of the fact that I'm a guest in this person's home, but this is also an example of this larger problem. And maybe it's okay to say, sure, I'll have a piece of this cake, or I'll have a bag of these chips this time so that I don't upend this friendship. But I think you just have to kind of call these things for what they are. And if you have friends that aren't willing to listen to you when you say, look, I don't like eating this. I feel crummy after I eat this. And thank you so much for preparing this, but my body just doesn't like it. And if they get really upset with you, maybe that's an opportunity for conversation with them. And I'm not going to be one that recommends getting new friends, but it might be a consideration because, you know, as Tim Ferriss says, you're the average of the people you spend the most time with. And it is true. If you're around other people.
It's true.
And we even know that eating trends spread through contagion, meaning that people who eat certain foods are going to be likely to spread those eating patterns to people that are around them. So you could be the healthiest eater. If you spend time with other people who are unhealthy, you're more likely to go that direction, right, than to continue getting healthy. That's just what happens.
Yes, absolutely. And I was just thinking when you were talking before, I guess because you're in Florida, it's just slipped into my mind that we were in Florida a couple of years ago and we went to one of the big water parks in Orlando with the kids. And we had a great day, but what really upset me was it was about nearly 40 degrees. It was really, really hot. And obviously there were thousands of small children, you know, some of them in their buggies, very, very young children. And I think with the exception of my 3 kids who were drinking water, everybody in this water park was drinking fizzy drink, soda, because the way they had structured it, and which I think is so sneaky, is the pricing was that it was more expensive to buy the water bottle than the fizzy drinks because you got a refill bottle. So it was a Disney bottle, a cup that you got, and then you could refill. So you could, for the same price, you could refill all day long with these sodas. So you saw, you know, tiny kids like 2-year-olds just knocking back these, you know, Diet Coke, whatever it was. And I almost felt like going to stand. I mean, my kids knew not even to ask for the fizzy drink because it would have been a no, and they wouldn't even have asked for it because I hate fizzy drinks. But I almost felt like just standing there with a megaphone, just trying to tell people, because the water thing was next to the refill, but nobody was going to the water because they'd got their nice Disney character thing. So, and I know how hard this is. I used to work for the food industry before I changed career. I used to work in PR for the food industry. And everything is about manipulating people. As you say, that's how they make their money, is to buy these things over and over and over again and to become addicted to them. So it is really hard for people to make wise decisions when you are faced with that insidious marketing and their ad budgets and their kind of shiny sponsorships with Taylor Swift or whoever it is. It's very hard for people to fight against that.
Yeah. And yet we blame people for not having the willpower when they go with, you know, the celebrity endorsed products. And there are so many things wrong with the way that this happens. And it's certainly not an American issue. We've seen this across countries across the world. But what has been the case is that food marketing targets children. It gets them to create brand loyalty around these products. These products are very much unhealthy in that they have tons of added sugars, they have unhealthy fats, and they're in general just quite devoid of nutrients. So that's cereals, that's soft drinks, that's candy. They basically blanket the airwaves, so that's TV stations for children with ads for these unhealthy foods, which we've seen actually change children's minds a whole lot more than they change adults' minds. No surprise there, right? We know that children have brains that are rapidly changing in response to their environment. They're very plastic. And so when they hear these signals, they're able to incorporate them into their brains much quicker. The other really concerning part of it is until children are older, they're not able to differentiate these ads as being something that is biased. So they take it at face value. Up until like 7 or 8, these children are just unable to see that this is something that is geared towards manipulating their thought process. They just say, oh, this ad says that these foods are good. These foods are good. And they say things like part of a complete breakfast. Oh, so that now makes me think that it's good for me. And that changes their preferences for the rest of their life. So when they're going back to the grocery store 10, 20 years later, they're more likely to choose those products that they were exposed to early on. So I just feel like it's overall unfair. And fairness is a weird word. I don't know what that actually means if you try to put it into absolutes. But I think that, you're basically programming children's brains for them to be unhealthy for the rest of their lives. And we know that in the United States, there has been substantial effort to market to children when they're in schools, to the point where schools have sponsorship from soft drink companies, to the point where schools actually have lesson plans that incorporate branding information from these companies. So what they do is they send out like a math sheet or a grammar sheet, and it is based in, the benefits of whatever product they're trying to sell. So as kids are going through and learning this information, they're being exposed to the brand name, but also the benefits of this brand, which again, I think is totally unfair, because you go to school with the idea that you are trying to learn things that will benefit you for the rest of your life. And it's literally the exact opposite. We are poisoning their minds such that they consume these physical poisons. So I think that, coming back to your point, and you think about how then that day at the water park is coupled with these sugary products, so that now in the memory, it's, oh, well, I drank this soda and that is reminding me of this really fun day. Let me go and have this again. And you see this in the marketing. It's using words like happiness and joy, and basically trying to get you to associate the consumption of these products with that physical sensation of positive emotion, even though we know that what those products do is, over the lifespan, increase rates of diseases. And now that we look at the fact that inflammation, which is one of the biggest problems, chronic inflammation in the Western diet and Western lifestyle today, is strongly associated with and may even be causal for some forms of depression. And we know that these foods and drinks are what are causing a lot of this inflammation. Then you can see that it is exactly the opposite of what's actually happening when you tell somebody that this product will cause happiness. It is literally, from my perspective, the type of thing that we should say, like cigarettes, this has been known to cause worse physical health, worse mental health, and an overall shorter lifespan. But there are a lot of regulations against saying those types of things, because we're not so sure. It's not happening over the course of days to weeks. It's happening over the course of years to decades. And that makes it very difficult to regulate.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you've said is just spot on, that it's just not fair. And, as a mother of 3 kids, I'm a functional medicine health coach, so I'm in a different position from a lot of mums. But even with that, I can't compete against these huge companies for my child's brains. I have no chance, even with all my expertise, all my knowledge, all my training. And when we went to the States, again, that trip a couple of years ago, all they wanted to try a Twinkie bar because these are things, they're mythical, isn't it? They watch The Simpsons, and a Cinnabon, isn't it? Cinnabon. And they were talking all the time about, we're going to have a Cinnabon. And eventually we got to a Cinnabon. They found it in an airport. We were there at this airport, I can't remember which one it was, at 5:00 in the morning. And it was this very cute branding for Cinnabon. It's beautiful boxes, and you've got the smell being pumped out. Yeah, it does. But it was 5 in the morning. I felt sick even being awake in an airport with all the strip light, let alone having a Cinnabon. But they were so excited, and they didn't care that it was 5:00 in the morning, and they were in because that's what they wanted, because that's what had been fed to them, because the marketing is so advanced, isn't it? So it's really hard for us to fight that.
It's interesting too, though. You think, oh, it's 5:00 in the morning, so we shouldn't be hungry. But what we know is that when you're sleep deprived, you're actually more likely to be hungry, to eat around 400 extra calories a day when you haven't had a good night's sleep, and to preferentially choose snack foods. So the airport is actually the perfect trap, because you're already sleep deprived, and then you add in stress, which also seems to increase in people who experience chronic stress. increased preference for unhealthy foods and to eat more food. So, I mean, yeah, they basically, they have you there. The other thing to consider, and coming back to kind of the bigger point as to the modern world and how it's set up to our disadvantage, is that you have billions of dollars that is being explicitly targeting children, or that is explicitly targeting children with food advertisement and the like. But obviously, you have billions and billions more that are targeting us to get us to do whatever the product wants us to do. Sometimes that's to our advantage, right? It could be that all of a sudden you read about this new product or it comes up in your social media feed and it's perfect for what you need to improve your quality of life. But a lot of times these are products that are actually a detriment, right? Especially in the food industry. These don't benefit us whatsoever. So then you take this situation where you are being hammered with these messages from literally childhood all the way into adulthood, and that you've been around other people who are consuming these products and you've been psychologically associating these products with happiness. And so now you say, oh, well, it's up to you. You have complete freedom of choice and you can decide not to choose it. That's not true, right? Because your brain has been now wired by other people to make it far more likely that you're going to make the unhealthy choice. So it's this fallacy that is promoted by all of these people, which is, oh, you still get to choose. It's just like with cigarettes, that the addiction doesn't exist. This was the idea for years and years. Oh, people don't have to choose to use cigarettes. Well, in theory, there is that opportunity where they don't have to choose the cigarettes. But if you put somebody who has been smoking cigarettes in front of a carton of cigarettes and tell them, try not to smoke, versus somebody who's been never touched cigarettes before, it's not the same probability. They both don't have a 50% chance of picking up that cigarette. The person who's been using it for years might have a 99% chance that they're going to smoke it, versus the person who hasn't ever even touched them before has a 5% chance of any interest. And that's the same way it is around our foods. So it's what I'm saying is the marketing industry exploits this idea that people have this freedom of choice, this complete agency over their decisions, knowing that, in fact, they've been programming our brains to make it very unlikely that we would ever say no to their products. And it's again, to use the word unfair, I think it's unfair for people to just dump all of that on the consumer and say, it's your fault if you don't make a good choice. We're just putting the options out there. When the truth is that their chances of making a healthy choice become so much less with each passing year, that marketing gets better and better at honing these messages for the individual, such that you really lost the opportunity to make a better choice.
Yeah. I'm thinking now about Diet Coke, which I loathe. But the number of people, Austin, I come across, and many of them end up with me, being coached, who are properly addicted to this stuff. And it says diet on it, so you would think that it would be a good way to lose weight if you didn't know the research, which, if you don't read about that sort of thing. The word diet, you think skinny and people want to be slim. And I've coached people who have 15 of these a day. So it's the first thing when they wake up, the first thing they sip by their bed, and it's the last thing they drink. Literally, it's by their bed. And then throughout the day. Or a guy I was coaching recently, who he would go out for dinner and he would drink 3 pints with one meal. And it's really hard for people to cut down on that. I mean, these things are designed to be addictive, aren't they? They're designed in a laboratory by food technologists to be addictive, and it's really tough to drop them, isn't it?
Yeah. So to just stick to the generic branding ideas here, the idea of these diet drinks sounded good when it started. It was, these drinks don't contain the sugar, and therefore they don't have the same amount of calories, and therefore they're good for people who are on a diet. But as you alluded to, the research shows that it's actually the complete opposite, that people who drink these continue to gain weight, in some cases more than the people drinking the standard drinks. And we also know that these artificial sugars may have damaging effects on our gut microbiome and in other places in our body. So there's nothing good about these drinks. it was, I think, promoted as a way that we could get people off of traditional sodas and onto something healthier. And it just hasn't been the case. But it still has a ton of caffeine. It still has all of that sweet activation in the brain. And in essence, it kind of tricks us both inside of our body and in our conscious thought into believing this is something that we should be doing until we find ourselves in exactly the situation you're describing, where we have intense cravings for these things and we're really not able to get through the day without these really high loads of artificial sweeteners and of caffeine that make our moment to moment existence tolerable. So I think that these are the types of campaigns we really have to dissect, because you see that word diet and then you just stop questioning. Oh, of course it's good for me. It's diet blank. And that's the type of misleading wording that can be so challenging for people to see through when they're watching ads for it all the time. They're seeing people order it in restaurants. They're always exposed to it when they go to the store, and they're seeing it next to the normal version of it. So they believe that they are making the healthy selection, when the truth is, for anyone trying to become healthy, you don't want to be in a soda aisle at all. And for that matter, probably not in a juice aisle either. These are just kind of these manipulated concepts that this is somehow a better thing to drink than water, when the truth is all of that stuff is garbage.
Yeah. So there's two stories that I want to relate to you. So one of them, when my eldest son, Max, was probably around 18 months old, he was just starting to talk. And I went into the supermarket with him sat in the trolley, and he started saying, juice, juice. And I looked, and he was pointing at a refrigerated, there was a refrigerator put in the fruit section of Sunny Delight, which I think, is it still called Sunny Delight or Sunny D or whatever they call it now? Yeah. And so this was like over 20 years ago. And at that point, it was very, very popular. And I just barked at him. I mean, this poor kid, it was only a toddler. It's not juice. It's not juice. But even from where he was sitting as a toddler who could barely speak, more than 5 words, he had picked up on the cues. So the cues were, it said not that he could read, but you had like a sunshine and it was in an orange bottle and kind of tropical, but they put it in a refrigerator. Now, this product did not need to be in a refrigerator because it's ambient stable. So it would have been absolutely fine in the fizzy drinks aisle, in the soda aisle. But to dress it up, to make it look as if it was juice, they put it in a fridge and then put it next to the apples and oranges. And that's how clever they are. So that even my Max, who was 18 months old, looked at it and he thought, juice, this is juice. Yeah. And it was 5% juice and the rest of it was complete crap. But people fell for that. And in fact, one of my friends was working in A&E at the time. She's a doctor. And she said she would get people coming in, mothers with children who are in great distress, severely constipated, in a lot of pain. And she would say to them, do they have fruit? And she said, yeah, absolutely. They drink Sunny Delight. So the parents thought they were making a wise decision for their children. And I really think it's criminal to do that to families. Yeah.
I think that the juice thing is such a kind of perversion of this natural idea. Also, natural is not a helpful word.
Yeah, I mean, not that juice is great anyway, but at the time, I thought orange juice was good.
Sure. Well, so you have these different stages of bad with juice, right? On the one hand, if you're eating an apple and you're getting the juice from the apple, great. There are probably still people out there, and I know many of them who would say, you don't want to be eating apples, they're high glycemic index. I'm just saying, on this spectrum, if you want to eat an apple, go for it. Now, on the other end, you have what you're describing, which is these semi-juicy type things, which have some juice, probably in the single-digit %, and then the rest of it is high fructose corn syrup or whatever other nonsense they fill it with. And those are really the places where they're targeting, parents, moms. They're telling them, get this healthy juice product for your kid. And you mentioned one, there are a whole slew of those over in the United States. where it's, oh, get them this healthy juice for the summertime when they're hot and they need to get all of that fruit. But it's anything but. So you range kind of the gamut between these products that have nothing to do with juice, but have somehow juice either explicitly or implicitly applied in their marketing, to fruit juices, which have added sugar, which is kind of absolute nonsense. Again, they're already super sweet, but you see these smoothie type drinks that have fruit juice and then a whole bunch of extra sugar. And then just standard fruit juice, which is getting better, but still not great. Because if you think from the evolutionary perspective, there's really no situation where a person is going to sit down and drink a gallon of apple juice or grape juice, right? But these are just things that we then associate with health because, oh, I have this 100% apple juice. When I was a kid, my parents gave me a lot of apple juice. They thought it was healthy. I got a ton of cavities, so I had to stop drinking apple juice. It's all just the question of saying how many degrees am I outside of what I could find in nature. If it's a whole apple, then you're pretty good. If it's apple juice without the apple fiber, you should probably think about that because there's something to that fiber. And by the time you get to the point where they're injecting a little bit of pureed apple concentrate into something that is otherwise completely artificial, you are really getting very little of the nutritional benefit. And if anything, you're just kind of compromising your glucose at that stage.
Yeah. But it's very hard for parents to discern that because the packaging looks very healthy. And I want to tell you that around 20 years ago, I used to handle the PR for a company that made substitutes for, so when the food industry took all the fat, out of products, when the low fat food craze started, obviously a big problem for the food industry was that you lose all the texture and the mouthfeel. So one of the companies that I did PR for made the modified food starches, chemically modified food starches that would replace that mouthfeel and texture in yogurts and so on. And one of the big campaigns, probably the biggest campaign I ever worked on was about 25 years ago. And what this company, it was an American company that made the starches, they'd come up with a way to modify the starch, which meant that you didn't need to put on the label that it was a chemical. I don't know how they did it. We never found out. But what it meant was that food manufacturers with exactly the same ingredients, all the crap still in it, could then put on the front of the packaging, all natural or as mama made, all this absolute nonsense, even though is nothing like as mama made because it's made in a big factory, but they could get away with putting these completely meaningless labels on the front of the packet. And then mums like me who wanted to do the best for their kids would see the pasta sauce, as mama made back in Italy. I would put that in my shopping basket because I was thinking, I'm a busy working mum. I don't have time to make my own sauce, but I'll get the best one for my kids because I want them to be healthy.
Yeah. So I don't want to say I pride myself, but I try to do my absolute best to pay attention to food labels.
Yeah.
Even then, these things sneak in. My girlfriend and I had some pasta sauce the other night, some marinara sauce on our food. And from the outside, it was organic, no additives. It said it was just tomatoes and some spices and really thought we were doing great. And then when it came time to use it, we realized there was cane sugar in it. What? Why? Right? But it's just, this is the default, is that everyone is trying to sneak something in to make it more palatable so that it can compete with the people who are out there making these really artificial products. And, it's a really great example of the fact that unless you're spending some time and looking into what you're consuming, or unless you can explicitly say, this is broccoli, right? Or this is a fish, and I know where this fish came from, you are probably going to be consuming stuff that isn't good for you. So it's really just a question of saying, how much does that matter and how much are you willing to invest, not necessarily financially, but in your time for education to understand where you could be getting thrown off. But the piece that really gets me is that the more you eat these types of foods that create inflammation, the more you're wiring your brain so that you continue to do that, the less you're going to be able to question it. And that's the part that's so scary because, with neuroplasticity, you are wiring your brain with everything that you do. And we know that we're learning that inflammation is potentially wiring our brains for more impulsive decisions, to decrease our ability to weigh the pros and cons of our choices. And so if you think about the fact that the standard American diet, which has been or the Western diet, has been exported across the world, and that might then lead to more impulsive decisions, which means, so much. It's not just about making short-term oriented decisions. It may also mean making decisions that are less concerned about the welfare of other people and the planet. You can see that through diet alone, we may be kind of increasing our rate of having these global problems where we're not treating each other well, where we're not caring about the environment, where we're not caring about where our food comes from, where we're more rash as far as the way that we even approach our finances or treat our friends and family. I think the complications, the outcomes that could be a result of our foods are so significant. And then just to take that one step further and to kind of tether it to stuff that your listeners would be familiar with, what you see is that the same type of impulsive decision making can be seen with conditions like diabetes, with insulin resistance to some extent, and also with obesity, and also with problematic eating. So people who eat junk food. So in essence, what I'm trying to explain here is that one of the fundamental mechanisms that might continue to promote people developing, sustaining diseases, as well as having the negative effects on like their relationships and their mental health, may actually be the inflammation that is a result of eating the standard foods that we're exposed to. You start to get into this cycle, you start wiring your brain for poor choices, that's going to then ripple out and both increase your risk of diseases that increase your inflammation and make things worse, but also make it harder for you to break out of that. That's a lot of doom and gloom. So I want listeners to know that there's actually a lot that we can be doing to go the other direction. And so we can get into that now if you'd like.
Yeah, tell us what we can do. What can we do?
So a lot of prelude to this point. But first, let me outline the general steps that I've been working with as it relates to reclaiming control over your brain, over your life. So I think the first step is the exploration. It's being going out and being exposed to new ideas. So if you're listening to this, you've already accomplished that, and good. The next step is awareness. So you want to raise awareness that maybe you didn't have all the answers. Maybe there is another way of doing things. Maybe there is something out there that you didn't know about before. When you have that awareness, it then leads to conflict, because all of a sudden you might say, hey, this is the way I've been doing things, and this is the way that might be better to do things. And so that's great. If you're feeling that conflict, even now and saying, wait, I am eating these unhealthy foods, I am engaging with these unhealthy habits, maybe this isn't ideal. That's wonderful, because it's a necessary step in getting you to the last step, which is the opportunity for change, the opportunity for growth. And so that's really where you have the chance to start making those new habits. It's where you can start having overall healthier behaviors, start, reclaiming your ability to make good choices. And so what are the things that we can do to facilitate these things happening? So our focus in this book, Brainwash, and also just my general focus, is on brain-based interventions that enable you to get into this growth cycle. I think the easiest way for most people to start getting into this cycle is to understand the importance of sleep on your thinking. Because research shows that even one night of sleep deficit is capable of changing the activation patterns in your brain, such that you have an increased activation in the amygdala to these kind of fear-inducing pictures. So I see that as you're increasing the activation of your reactive part of your brain, as opposed to the reflective part of your brain. And we know that if you don't get enough sleep, you have a harder time paying attention to things. If anyone want to try driving for 48 hours straight? It's really hard to do that, because the part of your brain that is tasked with maintaining attention, the prefrontal cortex, shuts down. So getting a good night of sleep, 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And I don't mean 7 to 8 hours where, you're watching TV into the first hour, or you're on your phone into the first hour, or you're waking up throughout the night. I'm saying to get a solid 7 to 8 hours of sleep is actually the quickest way to get onto this cycle where you're programming your brain for better decisions and to enable you to reach these next stages of growth. The other things that are worth considering, I'll do my very basics on food. Food is, as you know, very nuanced. There's a lot to think about. But as it relates to our previous conversation, I would say eating things that people have messed with the least is going to be your best bet. So avoid foods that have been processed. How do you know that foods have been processed? If you look on the back of a container, and if you're buying food from a container, that's a good first indicator. But if you see ingredients that you don't understand, that's a good indicator that your food has been overprocessed. So try to buy things that you can identify as single ingredient foods. And then if you are buying animal products, try to do your best to get those that have been messed with the least. That means trying to avoid animal foods that are either farm-raised fish or are exposed to hormones, antibiotics, and the like. So that's a very general idea on how to do foods such that you're lowering inflammation and so that you can program your brain for better choices. Now, there are a lot of other things. There's exercise, and listeners probably know about the value of exercise already, so I won't go into that. But the important point is that exercise, both in the short run and the long run, it increases blood flow and activation to your prefrontal cortex, and it's actually linked with the ability to make better choices, to be more thoughtful. So even if you decide, I'm just going to exercise, do a 20-minute run or whatever it might be for you, that could give you the window to start having insight into how to do other things. That could give you that opportunity to then eat healthier later that day because you're now seeing things in a more positive light. Other things that we talk about in the book, nature exposure. So why nature exposure? Well, it turns out that nature exposure also helps to deactivate that more reactive part of the brain. It helps to improve attention, which is very key because that means you're bringing your conscious thoughts to the front of your mind, the prefrontal cortex. That gives you the ability to reflect on things. And it also is probably one of the best interventions for lowering stress. As I mentioned before, stress compromises your ability to make good choices. And then we talk about mindfulness. Are these too quick? Too many?
No, keep firing them at us.
All right. And then we talk about mindfulness and meditation. And the reason that is so important, I think that first consideration with this is it just gives you insight into how your brain is working. It lets you look under the hood for an instant and say, as is the case for me, oh my goodness, things are a little bit crazy in here. I could use a little bit of work right now. And so that's the first step that you'll get if you just close your eyes for 20 seconds and have some insight into how things are going inside your head. It's quite impressive. But in the longer run, we know that meditation and mindfulness practices help to kind of increase the activation, again, of the prefrontal cortex, which is so key to giving you the ability to make better decisions, and calm down the more reactive part of the brain and lower your levels of stress. So these are things that probably a lot of listeners already understand are important, and I want to try to make this as pragmatic as possible. What I would recommend is the goal here is to get through this cycle of growth. And so to find one of these ways that you can start entering into this so that you can start developing the awareness and the conflict and the possibility for change. That might be sleep. That might be doing a meditation. That might be going out into nature. That might be exercising. That might be changing your diet. These are all possibilities. But the goal is to find something that you can make into a habit so that you can ingrain that into your neural pathways and give yourself then that window so you can start making other changes. I don't actually recommend you try to do all of this at once because that's not how habits are made. So pick something, whatever that might be, and then I would recommend going to look at BJ Fogg's framework or just some general habit formation framework. There's also Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit and James Clear's Atomic Habits. These are all good ways to start applying habits into your life because once you get that first one set up, then that's going to give you the starting point such that you can have, number one, more insight into what you want to do with your life and how to make those changes. And two, the ability to then wire those in and subsequently to improve your overall course of life through better habits.
Yes. Wow. And so much that you've just that you just shared that. Wow, I feel like we need like a day's conference rather than just, a brief chat on a podcast. But I'm so glad that you mentioned the relationship between food and our sleep, the night before, because to go back to the earlier point of the people I often coach who are drinking these vast amounts of Diet Coke, etc. And one of the guys I was coaching who needed to lose about 8 stone even to get to remotely healthy weight. And he was so focused on the food, like, and talking through every tiny detail. But then the thing was that he was on his iPad from 11 till about 1 in the morning every night. And what I was trying to get him to understand is that it wasn't just about, he was obsessing about, can I have half a teaspoon of mayonnaise on my, hyper focusing on these details. But the elephant in the room was that his sleep was rubbish and that he didn't want to give up that time because he felt that, he said, that's my me time. That is my me time. When I relax, that's how I relax, with my iPad, looking at whatever comes up. So that's I feel that's a whole different conversation, but it's so true that we have to look at all of these things, because unless we can help people relax and sleep, etc., the food side is massively important, but very much not the whole picture.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right with that. And it is an integrated model is really the only way to make this happen. Because in his case, he thinks that the problem is that he is stressed and therefore needs to fix that with watching whatever he's doing on the iPad. But that's, a proximate solution. It's the thing that is right next to that stress, as opposed to asking what is the ultimate solution, which is to look at why the stress is happening in the first place. And it may very well be that in this case, the stress is in part a result of sleep deficit. The sleep deficit is in part a result of the blue light from the iPad. And so what you see is that the solution, the proximate solution, is actually getting in the way of the ultimate solution, which might be, cutting back on the digital exposure and instead integrating some mindfulness techniques to promote stress reduction. So you're absolutely right. There's no way to pull out one piece and expect that will solve all the problems. But I do think that, you probably know this much better than I do. And as a coach, you have to understand that, you want to find that low-hanging fruit and start to get that person to see how they can make positive change, to give them the feeling of having accomplished something.
Yes.
And what I'm saying is, where you do that is ideally best suited for something that has also been researched to improve brain function, so that it's not just that they have the feeling of accomplishment, but it's also now that they have a better brain to enable them to then get to that next step.
Yes, absolutely. So the bottom line, just to kind of wrap this up, is that people can change their brain, that they are not victims of, they don't need to be victims of this pervasive culture, which unfortunately does very slowly destroy our brain. And I think it's so slow that people are not aware of it. I think that's part of the problem. So what would be your kind of summing up statement, if you could give one, to leave listeners with something that it's empowering and that they can go away and start to do?
Yeah, it's that things are not set up for you to be successful, but you have all of the necessary tools to be successful. And the way to success is not necessarily what you learned when you were younger. It's not necessarily the having grit and willpower and struggling until you make it. That instead it's understanding how your brain works and getting ahead of your brain function so that you can, through habits and through this neural programming, increase your odds of being overall successful and compound that interest over time. And the way to do that is to find an entry point that will enable you to develop better brain function. And that can be any of the things that we described. So it might be better sleep, it might be mindfulness, it might be diet, it might be exercise, it might be spending less time looking at an iPad screen.
Yes.
But do this and apply these habit-based techniques, and you will be then leveraging a whole bunch of different neuroscience to give you the out. And it's something that everybody can accomplish. There's all these different ways to get off of this merry-go-round of modern life that is very bad for our health. And I would just say, whoever you are listening to this, there is an opportunity for you to do amazing things if you're willing to make a change from what other people are doing.
Yeah, I love that. And just as a footnote, I did help that guy to get off the iPad. We got it out of his bedroom and he went to bed a lot earlier with a book, with an actual book. So, yeah, thank you. Well done to him. But Austin, that was so interesting. I could really chat to you all day, but I want to thank you for giving so much inspiration there, wrapped into the science. And I know that people would be interested perhaps in finding out a little bit more. So where can they follow your work?
Yeah, so I am building a website, but until that is done, I'd say the easiest places would be my Instagram, which is at Austin Perlmutter. And if you're interested in learning more about the book itself, Brainwash Book is the website. So just the name of the book, Brainwash with book, and it's .com.
Okay. And when is the book coming out?
Well, so the book is out.
Oh, the book is out.
Yeah. What isn't out is a website that I'm building right now.
Oh, I see. Okay. Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay. Well, I want to thank you again for all of your time, your wisdom. And I hope that people can start with one small thing, as you said, just to start with a low-hanging fruit, as you put so beautifully, and just start with one step and hopefully build a better brain.
Absolutely. And if you're in the UK, this is actually the UK version of my book, which is over there right now.
Brainwash. So, okay, definitely. I will definitely be buying a copy of that to add to my, I'll put it next to Grain Brain, which is one of my favorites. All right. Thank you so much again, Austin. Have a great day. Take care. Bye. Bye.